A barrier island, 9 miles north of Hatteras. The Atlantic in a black freight train, wind walking up the coast at 70 miles an hour. A weathered shingle-sided building on a low dune. Silver shingles. A square signal tower missing its lantern housing. Inside by the wavering halo of a single hurricane lantern. A narrow wooden staircase. A young woman climbs it. 22 years old. Her father's iron pry bar in her hand. The friction tape on the handle is older than she is. She stops at the foot of a ladder. She looks up. In the signal room above against the east wall, a cast iron flag locker is bolted to the studs with brackets you could hang a small engine from. Signal flags weigh nothing. Her fingers tighten on the pry bar. She climbs. Outside, the storm has not yet begun its worst hour. The hands were the first thing you noticed, not the face. The face came later in the dim halo of a hurricane lantern, drawn and watchful. But the hands came first. Young hands, 22 years old. The knuckles swollen the way knuckles get when a person has spent 5 straight months mending gill nets in a Hatteras fish house for $14 an hour. 3 nails broken below the quick. A thin white scar across the back of the right hand where a monofilament line had once parted the skin like a paper knife. Those hands were wrapped around an iron pry bar. The pry bar had belonged to her father. Hollis Calloway had used it for 30 years to chip rust from the engine bed of a 36-foot trawler called the Eleanor R. The handle was wrapped in friction tape so old it had gone the color of weak tea. He had wrapped that tape in the spring of 2003, the year Hurricane Isabel came through and took 6 boats out of Hatteras Harbor, and left the Eleanor R sitting in her slip without so much as a scratched gunnel. He had never rewrapped it. A man who tapes a handle properly the first time does not tape it again. Now the tape was in her hand. Now the pry bar was lifted to her shoulder. Now she was bringing it down against the lock of a signal flag locker that had been bolted to a stud wall on the 2nd floor of an abandoned Coast Guard life-saving station since 1917, and the building was shuddering on its foundations, and the wind outside was a freight train running on rails of black water, and the rain was being driven sideways against the shingle siding at 70 miles an hour. Tropical Storm Boris, just shy of Category 1. The ice still walking up the Outer Banks the way storms had been walking up that coast since the first surveyors arrived from Bath and Marblehead 300 years before. She brought the bar down a 4th time. The lock gave. The sound it made was the sound a deer rifle makes inside a closed room. The iron door swung 2 inches outward on its rusted hinge, and she stopped breathing, because she had not let herself imagine in any of the months she had been walking these halls and sleeping on a cot in the old crew quarters downstairs and pointing brick on the south chimney with an old fisherman named Earl Whitaker, that she would ever actually open the locker. The locker had simply been the locker, a thing bolted to a wall, a piece of furniture the United States Coast Guard had screwed into a stud in some forgotten summer of the First World War. But she had asked herself a question 3 minutes earlier, climbing the stairs in the lantern light. and the question had stopped her cold. Why does a flag locker need to be bolted to a wall with cast iron brackets you could hang a small engine from? Signal flags weigh nothing. A linen flag in a brass clip weighs less than a coffee cup. The kind of bracket a man uses to secure a flag locker against a storm needs to hold maybe 4 pounds of fabric. The brackets on this locker were rated for 100. They were the kind of brackets you used when you did not want a thing to be moved. Ever. By anybody. Not by a hurricane. Not by a salvage crew. Not by a future tenant with a screwdriver and an afternoon of curiosity. You used those brackets when you did not want someone to look behind. She pulled the door open the rest of the way. Inside the locker hung 12 signal flags, moth-eaten, faded to the color of old straw. The other 14 flags of the international code were missing. Had been missing perhaps since the morning of the 30th of September, 1958, when the last keeper stood his last watch and closed the door and walked away down the boat ramp to a waiting motor launch and never came back. She pushed the flags gently aside. Behind the flags was a gap, 3 inches, maybe 3 1/4, between the rear panel of the locker and the beadboard wall behind it. 3 inches that should not have existed in any honest piece of carpentry. Her hand went in. Her fingers, fish-broken and sea-rough, brushed past cold iron, past dry pine, past the powdered ghost of a wasp's nest. And then her fingers touched leather. Then her fingers touched canvas. Then her fingers touched paper, sealed at one edge with what felt beneath the pad of her thumb, like a brittle bead of pine tar, gone almost to glass. She did not pull them out. Not yet. She stood there in the signal room of an abandoned Coast Guard station, 9 miles north of Hatteras, with her hand inside a wall and a tropical storm screaming through the shingles. And she let herself simply feel the shape of what was waiting for her. Then she eased her hand back out empty, and she stood up and she turned and walked down the narrow staircase to the old crew quarters where the kerosene lantern burned steady on the long oak table. She would come back for them. She would. But first she needed to sit down at her father's bench. First she needed to remember how she had gotten here. Because Wren Calloway, 22 years old, with $10 to her name 9 months ago, and now the legal owner of a 114-year-old life-saving station on a barrier island where no one had stood a federal watch since Eisenhower's second term, had not arrived in this room by accident. She had been walking toward it her whole life. She had simply not known the address. To understand how she came to stand in that signal room, you have to go back to a Tuesday morning in early November of 2024, to a small fishing harbor on Hatteras Island, North Carolina, where the air at 4:15 in the morning had the iron taste of cold salt and engine diesel, and where a 4th-generation commercial fisherman named Hollis Calloway had been the first man to put his boots on a working dock for 30 consecutive years. Hollis Calloway was 58 years old that November. He wore Carhartt duck canvas bib overalls so faded the brown had gone almost to bone. Over the overalls he wore a navy blue chamois shirt, his late wife had given him for Christmas in 2006, 2 months before she died. He did not own a smartphone. He owned a flip-top Nokia with a cracked screen that he used to call the fish house with the day's poundage and nothing else. He woke at 4:15. He had woken at 4:15 since he was 19 years old. He pulled on his Levi's. He pulled on his wool socks. He went down the staircase that his grandfather Walter had built in 1962 with his own hands out of heart. Pine salvaged from a schooner that had run aground at Diamond Shoals. And the third stair from the top creaked under his weight, the way it had creaked under his father's weight and his grandfather's weight, and would on this last morning of his life creak under his weight one final time. Without him knowing, it would be the final time. In the kitchen, he set the percolator on the stove. He did not own a drip coffee maker. A drip coffee maker, in his estimation, was a device by which a man surrendered his morning to a machine. A percolator made you wait. While it pulled, he ate steel-cut oats from a saucepan, standing at the counter with a spoon of dark honey from a mason jar. His cousin in Buxton kept stocked for him. He drank his coffee at 4:25 black from a chip white mug that had a faded image of a dredge boat called the Sea Robin on one side. The Sea Robin had been his father Walter's boat. The mug was Hollis's favorite. Wren had broken its twin when she was 9 years old and had cried into the kitchen sink for 45 minutes. And Hollis had stood beside her and said, eventually, "Honey, a man who can't lose a coffee mug shouldn't own one." And that was the longest single sentence she ever remembered him speaking to her about an object. At 4:30, he opened the back door and stepped out into the cold. His daughter was already in the truck. She had been in the truck since 4:28. Wren Calloway, 22 years old, that November had been climbing into the passenger seat of her father's 1998 Ford F-25. Oh, at 4:28 in the morning for 4 straight years ever since she had finished high school and refused to go to college and signed on as her father's mate aboard the Eleanor R. She wore her father's old foul-weather bib cinched at the waist with a length of cotton lash line because the original buckle had broken in 2022, and neither of them had thought it worth replacing. Her hair was the color of wet sand. Her eyes were the color of the sound at first light. She looked to anyone who had ever known her grandmother Ruth exactly like a photograph of Ruth at 22 that hung above the fireplace in the parlor of the house her father was now backing the truck away from. They drove the 2 miles to Hatteras Harbor in silence. Hollis Calloway did not like the radio in the morning. The radio in the morning, he believed, was the act of letting other voices into your head before your own voice had had a chance to wake up. At the harbor, they walked down the dock to the Eleanor R. slip. Number 11. They had been in slip 11 since 2007. Hollis had paid the harbor master a woman named Marlene Stowe in cash on the 1st of every month for 17 years. Cash on the 1st. Never late, never short. He stepped aboard. Wren stepped aboard. He checked the oil in the Caterpillar 3208. Wren checked the bilge. He turned the key. The diesel coughed, once cleared its throat and settled into the low, even chuckle of a marine engine that has been maintained every weekend by the same pair of hands for a quarter of a century. In the wheelhouse, screwed to the bulkhead above the radio, hung a small brass ship's clock. 8-day movement. Walter Calloway had bought that clock at a chandlery in Beaufort in the summer of 1978 and screwed it to the bulkhead the day he took delivery of the boat. He had wound it every Sunday morning of his life until the Sunday morning of January 2001, when he had a stroke at the kitchen table while reaching for the wind-up key. Hollis had wound it every Sunday morning after that for 23 years. Wren had begun to wind it for him in 2022. He had not asked her to. She had simply seen him reaching one Sunday in July and had reached past his hand and turned the key herself. And Hollis had looked at her for a long second, and then he had nodded once, the way he always nodded, and they had not spoken of it again. They cleared the harbor at 4:55. The compass swung to 135 degrees. Hollis brought the Eleanor R up onto a long, easy plane, and Wren stood at the starboard rail with her hands in the bib pockets of her father's old coat and looked at the dark line of Hatteras Island falling away astern. And she felt the peculiar, pure happiness of being a person who is already at work while the rest of the country is asleep. That was the picture. That was the life. A father. A daughter. A 36-foot trawler. A Caterpillar 3208. A brass ship's clock screwed to a bulkhead in 1978. A blue chamois shirt. A percolator on a stove. A grandmother who had taught her to keep a ledger at the kitchen table when she was 10 years old. A great-grandfather who had walked off a southbound coastal schooner in 1921 with a wooden tool chest under one arm and a chart of the Atlantic seaboard rolled inside the other, and had never gone back to Bath, Maine because he had stood on the dock at Hatteras Inlet his first night ashore and watched the moon come up over Pamlico Sound, and had said to nobody in particular, "Well, all right then." 4 generations of Callaways on a 30-mile barrier island, a boat, a clock, a ledger, a life. It ended on the morning of November the 19th. She came down the stairs at 4:15 because her father had not come down the stairs at 4:15. She had heard the third stair from the top creak under her own weight, and not under his weight a full minute earlier. And she had paused at the bottom landing and listened, because in her entire life on this earth, she had never once gotten to the kitchen before he did. The kitchen was dark. The percolator was not on the stove. She went into the front room. Her father was in the recliner. He was facing the television. The television was tuned to the Weather Channel, with the sound off, and a low-pressure system was crawling east across Tennessee in a soft pulse of yellow and green graphics. The mug from the Sea Robin was on the side table. It had half a cup of cold coffee in it. He looked like a man who had decided not to wake up. She did not scream. She was a Calloway. She stood in the doorway of her father's front room for 1 full minute, and she watched his chest. And his chest did not move. And she crossed to the recliner. and put 2 fingers against the side of his throat, just below the angle of his jaw, where her grandmother had taught her to take a pulse when she was 12 years old. And there was no pulse. And she closed her eyes and she stood there, and she did not let herself cry yet, because there was a sequence of things that had to be done first, and Calloway's did the sequence first and the crying afterward. She picked up the kitchen phone and dialed 911. She said, "My father has passed away. 22 Soundview Road, Buxton. I will be sitting beside him until the ambulance arrives." She hung up. She called her sister Hadley in Raleigh. Hadley answered on the 3rd ring with the brisk, clear voice of a woman who has already been awake for 40 minutes, and answers her phone like it is a Carolina Trust Bank conference line at 9 in the morning. "Wren said Dad's gone, Hadley." There was a silence on the line. It was not a long silence. It was an exact silence, the length of a person reaching for the back of a kitchen chair to steady herself. Hadley said, "I'm leaving now." Wren said, "Drive safe." Then she went back into the front room and she pulled the wing chair across the rug until it was beside the recliner. And she sat down in the wing chair. And she took her father's left hand in both of her own hands. And she sat there with him for the next 38 minutes, until she heard the ambulance turn off Highway 12. And Wren Calloway sat with her father and said nothing at all. The funeral filled the Methodist church in Buxton. The church seats 210. There were 210 people in the pews, and there were perhaps another 60 standing along the back wall, and out into the vestibule, and down the front steps onto the gravel. The men wore white shirts and dark slacks. The fishermen of Hatteras did not own suits. They owned the white shirt their wife had bought them in 1998 for somebody else's funeral, and they wore it again now. A line of older men in the back wore older clothes. 3 of them wore the dark blues of Coast Guard veterans. Wren stood at the head of the receiving line for 90 minutes after the service and shook 270 hands and did not cry once. She saw near the back of the line an older man she did not know, big through the shoulders, stooped slightly, white hair cut down to a regulation half-inch. He wore a red flannel shirt under a Carhartt jacket, and on his left wrist he wore a battered steel Rolex Submariner so old the bezel had gone almost to bronze. When he reached her, he did not say his name. He took her hand in his hand, and his hand was the hand of a man who had pulled 250,000 feet of frozen Bering Sea long line in a previous life. And he said only, "Your father was the best stern man I ever shipped with." "I'm sorry." She said, "Thank you, sir." He said, "My name is Earl Whitaker. When you need me, I will be at the marina." He moved on down the line. She would not understand until July of the following year why he had said when and not if. That night, Wren sat alone at the oak table in her father's kitchen. The wall clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. She did not cry for her father. She had said her goodbye to him in the recliner. She did not cry in that long first night for the boat she would lose or the house she would lose, or the 4 generations of Callaways who had come to a stop on a tide table she could no longer read, because the man who had taught her how to read it was no longer reading anything. She cried when she finally cried for one specific reason. She cried because she did not know what she was supposed to do at 4:30 in the morning. She had built her entire self around a schedule. The schedule was gone. For the first time in her life, she did not know who Wren Calloway was when there was no boat to get to and no father to follow down a dock and no diesel engine waiting in a slip in the dark. She put her head down on her arms on the oak table in her father's kitchen, and she cried for 40 minutes for a girl she had stopped being at 4:15 that morning. Hadley arrived from Raleigh at 9 the following morning. She was 24 years old. She wore dark slacks and a charcoal sweater and low-heeled boots. Her hair was the color of dark walnut cut short along the jawline in the careful, businesslike way she had adopted in her second year at East Carolina University and never adjusted since. She had been a financial analyst at Carolina Trust Bank in Raleigh for 2 years. She was married to a man named Crawford Marsh, who was 27, who worked as a senior investment analyst at a regional bank in Raleigh called Carolina First Trust, and who had not driven down with her and who would not be at the funeral, and about whom Hadley would say only when Wren asked he's handling a situation at work. Wren noticed. Wren did not press. Hadley did the paperwork. Hadley did the paperwork for 3 days. She sat at the oak table in the kitchen with a folder bearing the Carolina Trust Bank logo on the cover, and she made phone calls and she opened envelopes their father had been opening only halfway, the way some men open envelopes when they already know what is inside. And on the third evening, she closed the folder and she looked across the table at her younger sister and she said, "Wren, we have to talk." Wren said, "All right." Hadley said, "There's no money." Wren waited. Hadley said in the careful, measured voice of a woman who had been trained at Carolina Trust to deliver difficult financial news without raising her own blood pressure. Dad took a second mortgage on the house in 2018 to overhaul the engine. There's $114,000 still owed on it. The homeowner's insurance lapsed last May. The boat's insurance lapsed the same month. Property taxes haven't been paid in 2 years. The IRS sent a notice in February that he ignored. He owed $4,700 in back income tax. The Caterpillar 3208 needs a full overhaul. Pete Halverson came down from Virginia Beach last week to look at it. He'll offer $45 for the boat. Dad signed a transfer on death deed for the house in 2019. That gets us around probate. The house on the current market will go for about $380. If we sell both and pay everything off, we'll clear about $240,000, split between us. That's $120,000 each. Wren listened. She looked out the kitchen window. The sun was coming up over Pamlico Sound. The water was the color of polished pewter. A great blue heron was standing in the marsh grass at the edge of the yard, perfectly still looking at something Wren could not see. Hadley said, "You can come live with me in Raleigh until you get on your feet. The guest room has a pull-out." Wren understood in the immediate and irreversible way a fisherman's daughter understands certain things that she was not going to Raleigh. She had not spent a single day of her life more than 2 miles from saltwater. She did not know who Wren Calloway would be in a city 3 hours from the nearest tide. But she also understood, looking across at her older sister, that Hadley was not asking permission. Hadley was reading the balance sheet aloud. Wren said, "All right, Hadley." Hadley said, Wren said, "I said all right." Hadley looked at her sister for a long moment, and Wren looked back, and there was between them across the oak table the silent, unbridgeable thing that had been between them since the morning their mother had died in 2008, when Wren was 6 and Hadley was 9, and Hollis had come home from the hospital in his rubber boots and had not been able to speak for 2 full days. Hadley said quietly, "You'll be okay." Wren said more quietly still, "I know. The house sold in March. The boat sold in April." Pete Halverson drove down from Virginia Beach on a gray Wednesday with a light rain falling on the harbor, and he walked the deck of the Eleanor R. with his hands in his coat pockets, and he did not say anything for a long time. And finally he turned to Wren on the dock and he said, "I'll keep the name." Wren said, "Thank you, Pete." He said, "Your father once gave me a tow off Diamond Shoals in 2008. My alternator went. I had 3 clients on board. He turned around and came 8 miles from me and would not take $1. I never forgot it." She said, "No, sir." He wouldn't have. Pete climbed aboard. He fired the Caterpillar 3208. The diesel coughed, once cleared its throat, and settled into the low, even chuckle Wren had been waking up to for 4 years. Pete stood at the wheel in his foul-weather coat, and he raised one hand to her through the wheelhouse window. She raised one hand back. She did not wave. Waving was for people you had just met. He eased the Eleanor R. out of slip 11 for the last time. He swung her bow toward the cut. He brought her up onto a slow plane, and she rounded the breakwater. And she was gone behind the jetty. And she was gone behind the marsh grass. And then she was gone altogether. Wren stood on the dock for 9 more minutes. She held her father's old canvas sea bag in her left hand. Inside the bag, his ball cap, his Buck Model 110 folding knife, 15 years of tide tables he had saved and rubber-banded by decade, the small brass ship's clock her grandfather had screwed to the bulkhead of the Eleanor R. in 1978, and her grandmother Ruth's green ledger with its last entry in Ruth's careful Palmer method hand, dated the morning of her stroke in January of 2015. She did not cry on the dock. She turned and she walked the half-mile up the harbor road to the Hatteras Fish House, where that very afternoon she would begin her first shift, mending gill nets for $14 an hour. She did not know, walking up that road, that her sister had left an envelope for her in the netting room. 4 hours later, after her shift, Wren would find it. The envelope would contain a single sheet of cream-colored stationery in her dead mother Eleanor's handwriting, dated August of 2006. 2 months before Eleanor's car had been run off Highway 12 by a nor'easter, and she had died at the age of 34, leaving 2 small daughters and a fisherman husband who would never quite learn to speak again. One sentence in the letter would be underlined in pencil 18 years later by Hadley. The sentence would read, "Hollis, you have to understand Wren is a child of the water. Hadley is a child of mine. Don't ever try to make them the same. When I'm gone, let Hadley have the books. Let Wren have the boat. Promise me that. Below the underline in Hadley's own neat hand would be 3 new lines. Mama was right. I found this going through Dad's papers. You deserve to know. Wren would read the letter, standing alone in the netting room at the back of the fish house, with the freezer compressors humming through the wall, and the smell of brine and ice in her hair. And she would fold the letter into thirds, and she would put it inside the brass ship's clock, in her father's sea bag. And she would not cry then either. She would simply walk upstairs to the rented room above the fish house that she had taken for $400 a month, and she would set the brass clock on the only shelf in the room, and she would wind it. It was Sunday. A Callaway wound the clock on Sunday. That was the rule. She wound it 8 full turns, the way her father had taught her, the way his father had taught him, the way her great-grandfather Whitman had once wound a clock of his own on the deck of a coastal schooner running south out of Bath, Maine, in the autumn of 1921. She set the clock on the shelf. She sat down on the edge of the narrow bed, and for the first time since her father had not woken up on the 19th of November, Wren Callaway, 22 years old, allowed herself one small, dry, mostly silent thought. All right, then. The same 3 words. 104 years later on a different shoreline, in a girl who had never met the man who had first said them. The room above the fish house was 9 feet by 12 feet. 1 window, 1 door, 1 radiator that knocked at odd hours like a man trying to remember a name. The walls had been painted the pale green of a hospital corridor sometime in the 1980s, and not since. She lived there from the 2nd week of April through the last week of May. 6 weeks, 43 nights. The freezer compressors in the cold storage, 1 floor below, ran on a 30-minute cycle. Wren had been on a fishing boat at 4:30 in the morning since she was 18. She did not need silence to sleep. She needed only a rhythm. The compressors were a rhythm. She slept fine. She worked 9 hours a day, 5 days a week in the netting room at the back of the fish house. The work was simple and not simple. A torn gill net came across her bench in a heap of green monofilament smelling of brine and rot. She spread it across the bench. She found the tear. She rewove the tear with a wooden netting needle her father had carved her when she was 12. She trimmed the ends. She passed the net off. The $120,000 sat in a Wells Fargo savings account in Manteo. She did not touch it. She thought of it when she thought of it at all the way she thought of the brass ship's clock on the shelf above her bed. It was a thing in the room. It was not a thing to be spent. It belonged to 4 generations of Callaways. She was the custodian. She walked once a week down to the harbor, just to look. Slip 11 was empty most weeks. The empty slip did not hurt her the way she had expected it to hurt her. Facts did not require feelings. Facts required only acknowledgement. She wound the clock every Sunday morning at 7. 8 full turns of the brass key. Once on a Sunday late in May, she caught herself counting her grandfather's turns and her father's turns and her own turns, and she calculated that the clock had been wound by Callaway hands roughly 2,400 consecutive Sundays since 1978. She did not know why this number sat down inside her chest like a stone. She only knew that it did. Saturday, the 24th of May. Warm evening. Low tide. Wren sat on the small wooden landing at the back of the building with her laptop open on her knees. She was not looking for anything. She was scrolling. She drifted into the Dare County government website. She drifted into the surplus property page. A boarded-up gas station outside Stumpy Point. A condemned single-wide trailer on a quarter-acre lot in East Lake. A former volunteer fire substation in Wanchese with a leaking roof. Third from the top, she found this. Abandoned U.S. life-saving station. Barrier Island, 9 miles north of Hatteras. Built 1911. Decommissioned 1958. Accessible only by boat or by an unimproved sand track that floods at high tide. Vacant since service withdrawal. Dare County Historical Commission. Relinquished interest. 2014. Asking price $10. Contact Dare County Clerk's Office. Manteo. She read it once. She closed the laptop. She opened the laptop. The listing was still there. The photograph attached to the listing was small and slightly out of focus. A weathered, shingle-sided building on a low dune above the Atlantic. A square signal tower rising from the center of the roof, missing its lantern housing. A wide, covered porch on the ocean side. She sat with the laptop on her knees and she looked at the photograph for 20 minutes without moving. She did not know then why the photograph would not let her go. Monday morning, 5:50 in the morning. Wren walked downstairs in her boots and her father's old Carhartt jacket and got into the 2003 Ford Ranger that had been the second Callaway vehicle her father had kept for hauling gear. The Ranger was hers now. Hadley had signed the title over in March in the kitchen without comment. She drove north on Highway 12. She crossed the Bonner Bridge at 6:15. She arrived in Manteo at 7:08. The Dare County Clerk's Office did not open until 8. She drank a paper cup of coffee at a diner 2 blocks over. At 7:50, she paid in cash and walked the 2 blocks back to the county building. The county clerk was a woman named Verity Holcomb. Mrs. Holcomb was 72 years old. She had been the Dare County clerk for 41 years since the spring of 1984. Her hair was the color of fine ash. She wore a charcoal cardigan over a cream-colored blouse. Pinned to the left lapel of the cardigan was a small silver brooch in the shape of a fouled anchor. The brooch had been a wedding gift from her late husband, who had served 2 enlistments aboard the USCGC Diligence in the late 1970s and had passed in 2017 after 51 years of marriage. She looked up when Wren came in. Her face changed. It changed the way a face changes when a person sees in the doorway of an office she has occupied for 41 years. A young woman she does not know, but whose last name she would have known on a battlefield from 100 yards. She said, Callaway. Wren stopped in the doorway. She did not know what to say. Mrs. Holcomb said more gently, "Come in, child. Close the door." Wren came in. Wren closed the door. Wren walked to the counter. She set $10 on the counter in front of Mrs. Holcomb. A new $10 bill she had earned with her own hands. A flat, unwrinkled Hamilton. And under it, 5 wrinkled singles from the cash register tip jar at the fish house. She said, "I'd like to buy the life-saving station." Mrs. Holcomb looked at the money. She looked at Wren. She looked at the money again. And then she did something that did not surprise Wren, but also did not in the moment seem entirely possible. She opened the second drawer of her desk, and she took out a buff-colored manila folder. And on the tab of the folder in her own neat hand were typed the words, "Station number 14, reserved." And the folder had been in that drawer for some number of years that Wren could not yet name. Mrs. Holcomb said, "I've been waiting for you." She slid a single sheet of paper across the counter. A deed. Filled in already. The grantee line blank. She said, "Print your full legal name there, please. And your date of birth." Wren printed her name. Wren Eleanor Calloway. Born September 4th, 2002. She slid the deed back. Mrs. Holcomb signed the bottom of the deed. She pressed the county seal into the wet ink with a small brass stamp that her predecessor had been using since 1962. She filed the carbon copy. She handed Wren a heavy iron skeleton key with a leather tag wired to the head. On the leather tag in faded ink was the number 14. She said, "That key has been in the bottom drawer of this desk since the morning of October the 1st, 1958. Wren held the key. Mrs. Holcomb watched her hold it, and then Mrs. Holcomb said in the voice of a woman who has been carrying a sentence for 6 years and is now about to set it down, honey, "Your father came here once." Wren's hand closed around the key. She looked up. She said, when Mrs. Holcomb took off her reading glasses, she laid them on the counter. She folded her hands. She said, "October of 2018. He drove up by himself on a Wednesday morning. He came in through that same door you came through. He sat in that chair right there for about 20 minutes without saying anything. Then he asked me if it would be possible theoretically for a private citizen to purchase the property at the listed price. I told him yes. He nodded. He thanked me. And then he said one thing to me, and I have remembered it for 6 years. Wren said very quietly. What did he say? Mrs. Holcomb said, "He said, Mrs. Holcomb, I am not the one, but the one is coming. When the one comes, please make sure the price is still $10. Wren did not move. Mrs. Holcomb said, "He drove home that afternoon. He never came back. I held the listing at $10 for 6 years against 3 challenges from the budget office and 1 from a county commissioner. I did not entirely know why. I think I do now." She reached across the counter and laid her hand briefly on the back of Wren's hand. She said, "He was waiting for you." Wren stood at the counter for a long time after that. She did not cry. She did not sit down. She held the iron key in her right hand, and she stood very straight, with her shoulders back, the way her grandmother Ruth had taught her to stand when she was 9 years old. And after some span of seconds that might have been 30, or might have been 3 minutes, she said, "Thank you, Mrs. Holcomb." Mrs. Holcomb said, "Go on, child. Go see your station. Saturday, the 7th of June, 6:20 in the morning." The sound was glass. Wren borrowed a 17-foot Carolina skiff from the Hatteras Marina manager, a woman named Marlene Stowe, who had been her father's harbor master for 17 years and who handed over the keys without asking what Wren wanted the boat for or where she was going. Pamlico Sound at 6 in the morning in early June on a windless day is one of the few inland waters of the United States that can pass for a quarter hour at a time as a sheet of mercury. Wren ran north along the inside of the barrier islands. The skiff threw a single clean wake. The sun came up behind her right shoulder and walked across her back and up the gunwale and into the bow. 25 minutes north of Hatteras she throttled down. The island had no name on any modern chart. The U.S.C.G. District 5 maps from 1958 had called it simply Station Number 14 Beach. It was 3/4 of a mile long and 200 yards across at its widest point. She brought the skiff in on the sound side. She killed the outboard. She walked the bow line up onto the marsh and tied off to a cedar stake that had been driven into the mud. She guessed sometime in the middle 1950s by hands that had also worn the dark blues of the United States Coast Guard. She walked across the island. It took her 4 minutes. The station stood on a low dune set back about 75 yards from the surf line. 2 stories tall in the main block, plus the square signal tower, rising another 12 feet above the roofline. The shingles were the color of weathered driftwood. She walked up the sand path to the porch. She put the iron key into the front door. She turned it. It did not turn. She turned it harder. It did not turn. She set the heel of her right hand against the door, and she leaned her hip into the knob, and she turned the key for a 3rd time, and the mechanism gave with a single deep clack, the way an old lock gives when it has not been asked anything in 67 years. The door swung inward. She stepped inside. The main floor was a single long room, 28 feet by 18 feet. The old crew quarters and mess hall. At the south end of the room, a red brick fireplace ran from floor to ceiling. At the north end, a small kitchen alcove held a soapstone sink and a wood-burning cook stove that bore the cast manufacturer's plate. Star, Detroit, 1909. Between the fireplace and the kitchen in the dead center of the room stood the long oak table. The table was 8 feet long and 3 feet wide and 3 inches thick, hand-planed. The legs were chamfered. She would not learn until later that the table had been salvaged in 1923 from the wreck of a 4-masted schooner that had broken up on Diamond Shoals. She only knew that when she put her right hand flat down on the surface, the wood gave a single small reply that felt in some way she could not name, like a hand laid for half a second on top of her own. She walked the perimeter. She opened the cabinets in the kitchen alcove. Dust. A petrified mouse. A tin can of corned beef hash with a 1956 wartime style of label. She opened the door of the upper left cabinet, the one nearest the window. Taped to the inside of the cabinet door with brittle, yellowed cellophane tape gone to powder along the edges was a black and white photograph the size of a postcard. She lifted the photograph free. 3 men in summer khakis of the United States Coast Guard, standing in a row on the porch she had just crossed. June of 1958 by the look of the light. 2 younger men flanking an older man in the center. The older man wore the cap of a chief boatswain's mate. He had a wide, square face and dark hair cut high and tight, and his hands were clasped behind his back, and he was looking directly into the camera with the steady, unspeculative gaze of a man who has been the senior officer at his post for 17 years and has nothing left to prove to a photograph. On the reverse, in soft pencil, Caldwell. Brennan Stokes. Last summer at the station, June 1958. Wren held the photograph at the table. She did not yet know the name Howard Raymond Caldwell. She did not yet know that this was the man whose letter she would, in another 3 months and 1 tropical storm, pull out of a 3-inch gap behind an iron-bolted signal locker on the 2nd floor of this same building. She laid the photograph face up on the oak table. She climbed the staircase to the 2nd floor. At the foot of the ladder to the signal room, she noticed something. She had to crouch slightly to see it. Carved into the heart pine of the doorframe at shoulder height, in small, careful block letters, made with the tip of a folding knife and then darkened, perhaps, with the soot of a kerosene lamp. HRC, 1958. She put her thumb against the carving. She did not go up the ladder. Not yet. She would understand in the months ahead that she had not gone up the ladder that morning because some quiet part of her had recognized that the signal room was not a room to be opened on the first visit. The signal room was a room that would have to be earned. She slept that night on a sleeping bag on the floor of the old crew quarters beside the oak table, with her father's canvas sea bag for a pillow. She lit a kerosene hurricane lantern at dusk and trimmed it low. The wind off the Atlantic settled into a long sigh against the shingles. The surf at the foot of the dune was 115 yards down the boat ramp, and the sound of it through the open shutters was not the sound of an enemy. It was the sound of a heartbeat much larger than her own. She woke at 4:30. She had not set an alarm. She got up. She made coffee on the wood stove. She watched the sun come up through the eastern window of the porch. She thought, sitting on the porch steps with the tin mug in her hands all right then. It was the 3rd time in her life she had thought that sentence. She was beginning to understand it was a family sentence. Earl Whitaker came across the Sound the next morning in a battered 19-foot Boston whaler with a wooden toolbox lashed amidships. He was 71 years old. He wore brown Carhartt duck canvas trousers and a faded red flannel shirt, and on his left wrist, the dented steel Rolex Submariner he had purchased in Honolulu in the autumn of 1978, with 6 months of saved Coast Guard pay. He tied off at the cedar stake. He walked up the path with his toolbox on his shoulder. He set the toolbox on the porch. He looked at the south chimney. He said, "That mortar's gone past the first inch on the ocean face. You'll lose those top 4 courses inside a year if we don't point it. I'll show you the mix. We'll need lime Portland washed sand. I have the lime in the truck. The Portland is at the hardware in Avon." He had not said hello. He had not introduced himself a second time. He had simply arrived as he had told her at the funeral he would arrive, and he had begun with the first sentence out of his mouth the work that needed to be done. She said, "Mr. Whitaker." He said, "Earl." She said, "Earl." He nodded once. That was the introduction. They pointed the south chimney across 3 weeks of July, working from a wooden scaffold he had built against the south wall on the second morning. 1 part Portland, 2 parts hydrated lime, 3 parts clean washed sand. Mixed dry, then wetted just enough to ball in the fist and break clean when dropped. Earl spoke a little while they worked. Not much. Enough. He had served in the United States Coast Guard from the summer of 1975 to the spring of 1980. 4 of those years aboard USCGC Storis, an ice-strengthened cutter, then home-ported in Kodiak, Alaska, running the Bering Sea Patrol along the Aleutians. The patrol's job had been to enforce the U.S. fisheries boundary against the Soviet longline fleet board Japanese trawlers for documentation, and pull American king crab boats off of ice floes in February, when their hulls froze faster than their engines could break them free. He had spent his final year aboard USCGC Westwind, an icebreaker on the Greenland Patrol, keeping a supply lane open along the east coast of Greenland to the radar stations of the old DEW line. He told her on the second afternoon, "The Bering teaches you 2 things. 1, a wave there is not a wave here. A wave there is 40 feet thick, and the top 8 feet of it is ice. 2, a sailor does not survive that water on luck. He survives on habit. Coil the line correctly. Sound the bilge every 4 hours. Never sleep on watch. Your father understood that." "Your father never slept on watch." She said, "He didn't. He said I shipped with him 12 years, from 98 to 2010. He took me on after I came off the cutters and onto a commercial boat for the first time, and I didn't know which end of a gill net to pick up. He taught me the inshore work. I taught him a few things from the Bering. We were even in the end." She said, "He never spoke about you." Earl said without looking up from the trowel, "Your father did not speak about most people he loved. That was not a failure of his. That was a feature of his." On the last morning of the chimney work, the 31st of July, Earl came up the path with a brown paper-wrapped envelope under his arm, in addition to the toolbox. He set the toolbox on the porch. He did not open it. He sat down on the top step of the porch beside Wren, and he turned the envelope over in his hands twice, and then he held it out to her. He said, "Your father gave this to me in August of 2015, 10 years ago. He came to my house on a Sunday afternoon, and he sat at my kitchen table for 40 minutes, and we drank 2 cups of coffee, and he said almost nothing. And then, When he stood up to leave, he set this envelope on the table and he said, "Earl, if I go before you, do hold this for Wren. Give it to her when she comes out to the station." I did not ask him which station. I did not have to. She took the envelope. She opened it. Inside was a single sheet of unlined cream-colored paper, folded twice. Her father's handwriting, the square block-printed handwriting of a man who had filled out marine fuel receipts and Coast Guard inspection forms his whole working life. The letter read, "Wren, if you are reading this, it means you have found the station, and it means I am not at home anymore. The brass clock on the shelf is yours. The tool chest in the back of the closet is yours. It belonged to Whitman. He brought it down from Bath in 1921, and he never replaced a single tool in it. Your grandmother's green ledger is yours. Earl kept all three of these for you for me when I could not keep them anymore. Do not ask me why I went to the station. Do not ask me what I know. You will understand when you get there, and what you do not understand at first, you will understand later. That is how the water teaches a person. And that is how I learned everything I ever learned that was worth anything. Earl is a good man. He stood his own kind of watch in the bearing. Trust him. He will not say much. He does not have to. Wind the clock on Sundays. Dad." She read the letter once. She folded it. She put it in the inside pocket of the Carhartt jacket she was wearing, which was the Carhartt jacket her father had worn for 19 winters. She did not say anything to Earl. Earl did not say anything either. Earl said at one point, looking out across the dune, "Your father was waiting on you to find the door. That's all. He was a patient man." She said he was. Earl said, "Patient man is a hard thing for the patient man's own kids. I won't pretend." She said, "No, sir." He said, "But it makes a fine inheritance." In the first week of August, a 28-foot Boston whaler outboard with twin Mercury Verados came across Pamlico Sound from the direction of Manteo and made a wide, showy turn at the end of the boat ramp and ran its bow up onto the sand. A man stepped off in deck shoes that had never seen a deck. His name was Travis Berman, 45 years old, real estate developer out of Wilmington. He introduced himself. He gave her his card. He proposed $280,000 for the station and the half-acre of dune on which it sat. His plan was a 4-room luxury inn marketed to discerning maritime heritage enthusiasts from the Triangle and Northern Virginia. $700 a night. Wren stood with one hand on the porch railing. She said, "No, thank you." He smiled. He had a very even white smile. He said, "I understand the sentimental angle. I do. But Miss Calloway, with respect, you are 22 years old, and you mend nets for $14 an hour. The roof on this place is going to need $40,000 inside 10 years. The septic doesn't exist. The well is dry. The first real hurricane is going to put your front porch into Pamlico Sound. I'll be back in a month." He paused. He looked at the brick fireplace through the open front door. He said in a quieter voice, "My father was a plumber in Wilmington. He died when I was 12. The last thing he told my mother was not to let me apprentice. He said, 'Don't let the boy go to the trades.' I heard him say it. I have not picked up a pipe wrench in 33 years. I built things instead. I built 3 resorts on Bald Head. I am not apologizing for that." He turned around. He walked back down the ramp. He started the twin verados and he ran his whaler back across the sound the way he had come. Wren tore his card in half. She tossed it into the cold ashes of the fireplace. 6 days later, a certified letter arrived for her at the fish house forwarded by Mrs. Holcomb. The letter was on the stationery of a Raleigh law firm. It cited North Carolina General Statute Section 160A-269 and demanded that Dare County void the $10 conveyance and reopen the property to public auction. Wren read the letter twice. She drove to Manteo. She put the letter on Mrs. Holcomb's counter. Mrs. Holcomb read it without her glasses on her lips moving slightly. She set the letter down. She said, "He's not wrong about the statute. He's wrong about the exception." She opened a green hardback book from her shelf. She turned to a page she had marked years ago with a thin slip of yellow paper. She said, "Special Provision 4. A surplus property listed continuously for 10 years or more, without a buyer, may be conveyed at nominal price to a private grantee who commits to preservation of a historic property of public significance. This station was listed September of 2014. We are now in August of 2025. That is 11 years. He has no case." She closed the book. She looked at Wren over the top of her reading glasses. She said, "But child, he will have a hearing. He has a lawyer. The lawyer will make it a hearing. The Board of Commissioners will sit and listen, and Edith Sayre will preside, and you will need to stand up in that room and say a sentence about what this station is. And you will need to say it in your own voice, not in your father's voice, not in your grandmother's, yours." "Can you do that?" Wren said. "Yes, ma'am, I can." Mrs. Holcomb said, "Good, because the hearing is the 2nd Tuesday of September. And after the hearing, if we win, there is a tropical wave forming off the Bahamas that the Weather Service has just upgraded to a depression. And if it keeps the track they are calling for, it will come up this coast as a storm with the name on it before the month is out." Wren took the certified letter back across the counter and folded it once and put it in her jacket pocket beside her father's letter. And she walked out of the office and down the front steps of the county building into a hot, bright August afternoon on the Carolina coast. The wind that had just begun to ruffle the flag at the top of the courthouse pole had come 3 days earlier off the warm surface of the open Atlantic 800 miles to the southeast. And it had a name now, and the name was Boris. The hearing room of the Dare County Board of Commissioners was on the 2nd floor of the County Administration Building in Manteo. The dais ran along the north wall, 7 leather chairs behind a curved walnut counter. The American flag and the North Carolina state flag stood in brass stanchions at the corners of the dais. Wren had never been inside the room before. She walked in at 1:40 in the afternoon on the 2nd Tuesday of September. with Earl Whitaker beside her. And she stopped just inside the doorway because the room was full. It was not full the way she had expected. There were 63 people in the room. She counted them later sitting in the truck. Pete Halverson had driven down from Virginia Beach. He sat in the second row in a clean blue work shirt. Beside him sat a man named Calvin Daniels who had fished kingfish tournaments with Hollis Calloway for 18 years and had retired to Hatteras 4 years ago and had not until that morning owned a tie. He owned one now. He had bought it at a drugstore in Avon at 9:30 that morning. It was navy blue. It was crooked. Behind Pete and Calvin sat 11 other commercial fishermen from Hatteras. They had all somehow arrived in clean white shirts and Sunday slacks. Their ball caps were in their laps. Along the north side of the room, sitting in a tight row against the wall, were 4 older men in dark blue blazers. Coast Guard Auxiliary. Mrs. Verity Holcomb sat at a small table to the left of the dais in her capacity as clerk of court. Travis Berman sat at the petitioner's table on the right side of the room. Beside him sat his attorney, a man named Charles Pemberton, 60 years old, silver-haired in a charcoal 3-piece suit and small steel-rimmed glasses. And at the back of the room in the last row of folding chairs in a dark gray cardigan, with her hair brushed neatly back from her face and her hands folded in her lap, sat Hadley Calloway Marsh. Wren had not told Hadley about the hearing. She did not know who had told her. She looked at her sister for one long moment from the doorway, and Hadley, 24 years old, met her eye across the length of the room and did not nod and did not smile and did not need to. Wren walked down the center aisle and took the seat at the respondent's table. Earl sat down beside her. Commissioner Edith Sayre called the meeting to order at 1:45. She was 58 years old, tall, sharp-jawed. She invited Mr. Pemberton to present. Pemberton stood. He spoke for 14 minutes about fair market value and fiduciary duty to taxpayers of Dare County. He referred to Station 14 as the property. He did not in 14 minutes refer to it as the station. He cited 3 appellate cases. He laid out a sequence of remedies, the preferred of which was a voiding of the August deed and an open auction at which his client was prepared to bid in cash the sum of $280,000. He sat down. Commissioner Sayre invited the respondent's representation to respond. Wren stood up. Mrs. Holcomb stood up at the same moment, and Mrs. Holcomb spoke first. Mrs. Holcomb's voice was thin and clear and old. She said, "Mr. Chairman, before respondent speaks, the clerk's office wishes to enter into the record one document." She held up the green hardback book. She read the entire Special Provision 4 aloud. She read it slowly. She read it the way a person reads aloud to a child who is going to be asked to recite it back in the morning. When she finished, she closed the book and she said, "Station 14 was placed on the surplus rolls of Dare County in September of 2014. It has remained on those rolls without a buyer for 11 years. Miss Calloway's preservation commitment was filed at my desk on the morning of June 3rd of this year. Special Provision 4 applies. The conveyance is lawful. The clerk's office wishes that statement entered. She sat down. Pemberton at his table did not look at his client. Pemberton looked at his folio. Commissioner Sayre's mouth had gone into a thin, straight line. She said, "Miss Calloway, you may respond." Wren put her hands on the edge of the table. She had not written anything down. She stood. She did not approach the microphone. She spoke from her place. She spoke in the voice she used on a deck. She said, "My name is Wren Eleanor Calloway. I am 22 years old. I mend gill nets in the Hatteras Fish House for $14 an hour. I do not have a college degree. I do not have an attorney. I have $10 and a ledger my grandmother kept and a key Mrs. Holcomb gave me on a Tuesday morning in June." A silence. She said, "Mr. Berman would like to make the station a hotel. That is his right. He is a businessman. He is not a bad man. He has been honest with me. He told me the first time we met that the roof will need replacing in 10 years, and the porch will go into the sound in the first real hurricane, and that I am a 22-year-old net mender. And he was right about all three things." She paused. She said, "But I would like the board to understand something else." She paused again. She said, "In the 47 years that Station 14 was an active life-saving station of the United States Coast Guard, it stood by for 341 rescues. I have read the logbook. One of those 341 rescues took place on the 14th of September, 1944, during the Great Atlantic Hurricane. The keeper of the station, Chief Boatswain's Mate Howard Raymond Caldwell, launched a Type T motor lifeboat into 80-knot winds at 4:45 in the morning to recover the crew of a foundering trawler called the Ruth Ann, 8 miles southeast of Diamond Shoals. He brought 3 men back alive. The master of the Ruth Ann was 47 years old that morning. His name was Whitman Calloway. She paused for the 3rd time. She said very quietly, "He was my great-grandfather." In the second row, Calvin Daniels had taken off his glasses and was wiping them slowly on the hem of his shirt. Wren said if Chief Caldwell had stayed inside that morning, my great-grandfather would have drowned. If my great-grandfather had drowned, my grandfather would not have been born. If my grandfather had not been born, my father would not have been born. If my father had not been born, I would not be standing in this room. She said Mr. Berman would like to buy the station for $280,000. I bought it for 10. The board is being asked today to decide whether $10 is a real price. She said, "I will tell you what $10 is. $10 is a mark. $10 is a small, honest mark that the people of this county remember. That some things are not for sale." The station was not a building. The station was a promise. The promise was that on a coast where nobody much was paying attention, somebody was. Chief Caldwell paid attention on the 14th of September, 1944. And because he did, I am here. I am asking the board to let the promise stand. She said, That is what I came to say. She sat down. The room was silent for the length of one slow tide. Commissioner Sayre adjusted her microphone. She cleared her throat. She invited the board to vote. The vote was 5-2. The deed stood. Travis Berman did not look at Wren when he left the room. In the hallway outside, in the dim, wide corridor of the second floor of the county administration building, Hadley was waiting. She did not speak. She put one hand briefly on Wren's sleeve and then she let it fall. She said, "Mama was right. You are a child of the water." Wren said, "Drive safe, Hadley." Hadley said, "I will." Tropical storm Boris made landfall 30 miles south of Cape Hatteras at 3:12 in the morning on the second Wednesday of September. The eye crossed the Outer Banks 22 miles south of Station 14. Sustained winds at the eye wall were 81 miles an hour. Gusts at Diamond Shoals Light were measured at 94. Storm surge was 4 feet above mean high water. Wren did not evacuate. Earl had argued for evacuation across the kitchen table at his small house in Avon 4 nights earlier, and Wren had listened to him the whole way through. And at the end she had said, "Earl, this station stood through 1944, and 1954, and 1996, and 2003 and 2011. It will stand through this. I will stand through this with it. That is how it was designed." Earl had looked at her across the table for a long moment. Then he had said, "All right then," and that had been the end of the argument. Tuesday afternoon, the 2nd of September. Earl and Wren put plywood across every window on the seaward side of the building. They lashed the porch furniture into the front room. They pulled the Boston whaler up onto the marsh at the sound side and tied her bow and stern to 4 cedar stakes Earl had driven that morning with a 6-pound maul. At dusk, Earl stood on the porch with his ball cap in his hand, and he said, "You are going to be alone here from about 10 tonight until probably noon tomorrow. The wind will come from the southeast first, and then it will swing through to the north, and then it will quit. The worst hour will be the hour either side of the eye passage. Stay on the ground floor unless you have to go up. If something gives, run for the chimney corner. That wall is the oldest wall, and it is brick, and it will be the last thing standing." She said, "I know." He nodded. He set something in her hand. It was a small brass surveyor's compass with a hinged lid in a leather case the color of black tea. He said, "K&E Surveyors. I borrowed this from a man named Halsey in Ketchikan in 1979, and I have not yet found a way to return it. It does not fail. If the building goes and you have to leave on foot in the dark, walk 315 degrees from the porch step. That puts you on the sound shore where I will be with the whaler at first light." She said, "Earl." He said, "Take it." She took it. He left at 6:45. She stood on the porch and watched the whaler push off the marsh and head south. She went inside. She closed the front door. She slid the iron crossbar into its bracket. The wind came up at 9:20. By 11, the building was talking. A two-story timber-framed shingle-sided house in an 80-knot wind does not creak the way a boat creaks. It groans. The groan begins somewhere low in the sill plate and rises up through the studs into the roof framing and out the eaves. She did not pace. She sat at the table. She had laid 3 things out on the oak top in front of her. Ruth's green ledger, Whitman's wooden tool chest, its hasp folded but unlocked, the brass ship's clock from the bulkhead of the Eleanor R ticking quietly at her left elbow. She had simply taken them out of the sea bag one at a time after Earl left and set them down, and then not moved them. At 12:40, the porch tin began to go. She did not get up. She thought very clearly the porch is built into the framing of the main house at 4 points, and the tin is fastened to the porch with screws driven into spruce furring. The tin can go. The framing will hold. She had thought this thought in her father's voice. She had thought this thought in her grandfather Walter's voice. She had thought this thought in her great-grandfather Whitman's voice. She had also thought it in her own. The eye came at 3:05. The wind dropped in a single 40-second span from a freight train to a low, long sigh. She got up from the table. She picked up the kerosene lantern. She went to the foot of the staircase. She climbed the stairs. At the foot of the ladder to the signal room, she paused. The lantern light caught the small, careful block letters carved into the storage closet doorframe at shoulder height. HRC, 1958. She put her thumb on the letters. A question opened in her like a hatch. Why are the iron brackets on a signal flag locker rated to hold 100 pounds? She thought. Signal flags weigh 4 pounds. She thought the keeper of this station served 17 years. He carved his initials into a doorframe on the way out. A man who carves his initials into a doorframe is a man telling the next keeper that he was here. A man who tells the next keeper that he was here is a man who has left a message for the next keeper. She climbed the ladder. The signal room was 8 feet by 8 feet. Against the east wall stood the signal flag locker. Cast iron brackets, heavy enough to hang a small engine from. She set the lantern on the floor. She came back down the ladder. She walked down the stairs to the front room. She picked up her father's pry bar from where it leaned against the brick chimney. She climbed the stairs again. She climbed the ladder again. She stood in front of the locker. She brought the bar down once. The lock did not give. She brought it down a second time. The lock did not give. She brought it down a third time. The lock did not give. She set her feet wider. She brought it down a fourth time with the full weight of her shoulder and her hip and her grandfather's blood and her great-grandfather's blood and her father's blood and her own. The lock gave. The iron door swung 2 inches outward. 12 flags, Alpha through Lima. The other 14 long since lost. A gap of 3 inches. She put her hand in. Her fingers found leather. Her fingers found canvas. Her fingers found tar-sealed paper. She let her hand simply rest in the wall on the small, careful arrangement that a 51-year-old Coast Guardsman had made on a small wooden shelf on the last working evening of his life, 67 years before. And she said, without thinking about saying it into the empty room, "Chief, it's me." Then she brought them out. She carried them down the ladder. She carried them down the stairs. She set them on the oak table in the front room beside the green ledger, and the brass clock and the wooden tool chest, and the 3 new objects fit themselves into the triangle of lantern light, as though the triangle had been a square all along, and someone had finally remembered the 4th corner. The wind came back at 3:43. She opened the logbook first. Black leather embossed in faded gold. United States Life-Saving Service / U.S. Coast Guard / Station Number 14 / Cape Hatteras Section. She turned to the last entry. Station decommissioned today per USCG, District 5, Order Number 58-449. Final watch stood by Keeper H.R. Caldwell, BMCUSC, G0600 to 1800. No vessels in distress. This station has saved 341 lives in 47 years of operation. I am the last keeper. Howard Raymond Caldwell, BMCUSCG. She opened the canvas pouch. She tipped it over the table. 28 gold coins poured out across the oak in a soft, heavy run. She counted them twice. 28. She lifted the letter. The tar seal cracked away clean across the long edge. The cream-colored paper inside was unfoxed. She read it. She read it twice. She read it a 3rd time at half voice. To whoever finds this, my name is Howard Raymond Caldwell. I have served as keeper of this station from June of 1941 until today, the 30th of September, 1958. I am 51 years old. Tomorrow I will close this station and transfer to a desk posting in Elizabeth City that I do not want. I have kept this station through 17 years. That included the war during which we patrolled this beach for German submarines every night, in all weathers and the hurricanes of 1944 and 1954, and 341 rescues of fishermen and sailors and pleasure boaters, and 1 child on a rubber raft who had drifted 2 miles offshore from a beach in Nag's Head, and who was, when we reached him, singing a song about a whale. The gold is what I have saved from my Coast Guard salary across 17 years. I did not trust banks after what happened to my father's savings in 1933. I hid the coins behind the signal flag locker because the locker is bolted to the wall with iron brackets, and no person who does not know the station intimately would think to reach behind it. The logbook belongs to this station, and I cannot bring myself to surrender it to the district office in Elizabeth City, where it will be filed in a cabinet and forgotten. I do not know who will find this shelf. I hope it is a person who knows the water. I hope it is a person who has stood a watch. I hope it is a person who understands that a life-saving station is not a building. A life-saving station is a promise that someone is paying attention. If you are that person, this station is yours now. Keep the light. Howard R. Caldwell, Boatswain's Mate, Chief, USCG, September 30th, 1958. She set the letter down. She put both hands flat on the table. She closed her eyes. And for the second time in her adult life, Wren Calloway lowered her forehead to the wood of an old table on the outer banks of North Carolina and let her shoulders go. She did not cry for long. A minute, maybe two. When she lifted her head, she wiped her cheek on the cuff of her father's Carhartt jacket, and she said into the room, "Thank you, Chief. I will keep the light." Then she turned to September of 1944. She found the 14th. 0430 hours. Distress call received via VHF Channel 16 from commercial trawler Ruth Ann. Lifeboat USCG 2435. Launched 0445. Coxswain Caldwell. BMC. Vessel located 0612. 3 crew aboard. Rescued Whitman Calloway, age 47, master. Eugene Perry, age 32, mate. Raymond Delaney, age 24, deckhand. All alive. C was the worst I have seen this watch. H.R. Caldwell, BMC. She put her fingertip on her great-grandfather's name. She said very quietly, "Thank you. For him. For my grandfather. For my father. For me." Then she closed the logbook. Outside, Boris kept going. Inside, the lantern kept burning. Earl came across the Sound at 11:20 the following morning. The Boston whaler nosed up onto the marsh exactly where he had pulled her in 2 days earlier. The cedar stakes had held. The lines had held. Boris had moved north and inland and was now somebody's problem in Virginia. Wren met him at the cedar stake. She wore her father's Carhartt over a wool flannel shirt, and her hair was tied back with the same length of cotton lash line she used at the fish house. She looked, Earl would say later, to a man in Avon like she had been up all night and had decided to skip going to bed entirely. He stepped off the whaler with his toolbox on his shoulder. He set the toolbox on the sand. He looked at her face. He said, "You went up that ladder." She said, "I did." He said, "Anything up there?" She said, "Some things." He nodded once. He did not ask her what. He had not asked her father what for 12 years aboard the Eleanor R., and he was not about to start now. They walked the perimeter of the building. The damage was what they had thought it would be. The southeast porch tin was gone, 3 sheets of it scattered across a 1/4 mile of marsh on the Sound side. The lower left corner of the plywood over the southeast bedroom window had given exactly the way Wren had told herself that afternoon it would give, and a long shard of the original window glass underneath had broken inward across the floorboards. The shingles on the southeast face had lost about 120 individual cedar squares, mostly along the lower courses. The chimney they had repointed in July had not lost a single brick. Earl said, looking up at the chimney, "That mortar held." Wren said, "It did." He said, "That's a Rodanthe mix. That mix has held the lighthouse since '52. She said, "Yes, sir." They went inside. The oak table was where she had left it. The objects on the table were where she had left them. The brass clock was still ticking. It had 8 days. It had 4 more. Earl saw the table. He saw the leather logbook in the center, and the cream-colored letter on top of it, and the open canvas pouch beside it, with 28 gold coins in a soft, heavy stack. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he took off his ball cap. He held it against his chest. He said, "Christ in heaven." Wren said, "Yes, sir." He sat down on the bench opposite her. He set his ball cap on the table beside the clock. He said, "May I?" She said, "Yes, sir." He picked up the letter. He read it once, slowly, his lips moving the way Mrs. Holcomb's lips moved when she read a contested filing. When he reached Keep the Light, he set the letter down very gently, the way a man sets down a thing he is afraid he will break. And he did not look at Wren, and he did not look at the gold, and he looked straight out the front door through the open frame at a stretch of Atlantic that was that morning the color of clean slate. He said, after a long time, "Wren." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "You called the Coast Guard yet?" She said, "No, sir." He said, "You're gonna need to." She said, "I know." He said, "You're gonna need to call District 5 in Portsmouth today. The logbook is government property. The gold is something a lawyer will have to sort out. The letter is yours. Nobody can take that from you." She said, "I know." He said, "They'll send somebody down, a lieutenant commander probably, with a historian." She said, "That's about what I figured." He picked up his ball cap. He set it back on his head. He stood up. He said, "I'll point the new shingles tomorrow. You make the call this afternoon." She made the call that afternoon from the kitchen of the small house in Avon that Earl let her use whenever she needed a landline, on a black rotary phone that had been on his kitchen wall since 1991. A petty officer in Portsmouth took the information. He put her on hold. A second petty officer came on the line, and Wren told it again slowly in the patient voice she used at the fish house when a buyer was trying to talk her down on poundage. The second petty officer put her on hold. A Lieutenant Commander Alistair Doyle came on the line. He was 44 years old. His voice on the telephone was the voice of a man who had grown up in a Coast Guard household and had spoken into telephones in the Coast Guard manner since he was old enough to answer one. Clear, brief, polite, not a wasted syllable. He said, "Miss Calloway, I'd like to drive down on Friday with Dr. Margaret Conway from the historian's office. Would that be acceptable?" She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "I want to be clear about one thing on the phone before I come." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Nobody is taking anything from you. We are coming to look. We are coming to document. If we find that something is government property, we will discuss it with you, and we will arrive at an arrangement that respects what Chief Caldwell intended. That is how this office handles findings of this kind. It is not a raid. Do you understand?" She said, "I do, sir." "Thank you." He said, "Friday. We will be at the Hatteras Marina at 9 in the morning. Mr. Whitaker has agreed to bring us across." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Miss Calloway." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "My grandfather served in the Coast Guard out of St. Augustine in 1943. Submarine patrol. I never met him. He drowned in 45. I want you to know that before I come." She said, "Thank you, Commander." He said, "Friday." He hung up. Friday came clear and cold, the first true touch of fall on the Outer Banks. Earl brought Lieutenant Commander Doyle and Dr. Conway across the Sound at 9:15. Doyle was a compact, dark-haired man in his service blues. Dr. Conway was 56, wore her gray hair in a single braid down her back, and carried on a strap over her shoulder. A soft canvas archival case that Wren would learn contained a pair of white cotton gloves, a magnifying glass, a small folding measuring stick, and a notebook bound in dark green linen. They came up the path together. Wren met them on the porch. Doyle removed his cover. He said, "Miss Calloway, thank you for the call." She said, "Yes, sir. Come inside." She led them in. The objects were on the oak table where she had left them untouched since Earl had picked up and set down the letter on Wednesday. The logbook in the center, the letter on top, the pouch beside. Dr. Conway stopped just inside the door. She put one hand flat against her own sternum. She said very quietly, "Oh." She did not approach the table for a full minute. She just stood there and looked at it in the slanting morning light through the east windows, and Wren, watching her, understood that she was looking at the table the way Wren had looked at the table the first time her own hand had rested on it. Then Dr. Conway crossed to the table. She set down her case. She drew on the white cotton gloves with the unhurried care of a person who had drawn them on across 40 years of stack rooms and field offices. She bent over the logbook. She turned the cover. She turned the second page. She turned the third page. Doyle stood behind her with his hands clasped behind his back. He did not look at the gold. He looked at the logbook over her shoulder. For 35 minutes, nobody in the room spoke. At the end of the 35 minutes, Dr. Conway straightened. She drew off the gloves. She turned to Wren. She said, "Miss Calloway, this is one of the finest pre-modern keeper logs I have seen in 22 years at the historian's office. The pages are intact. The hand is consistent. The dating is unbroken. We have in Washington 7 full keeper letters of this period. You have just brought us our 8th. She paused. She said, "Thank you." Wren said, "No, ma'am. Thank you." Doyle picked up the canvas pouch. He weighed it once on his palm. He set it back down. He did not open it. He said, "Miss Calloway." "May I sit?" she said. "Yes, sir." He sat at the head of the bench facing her across the table. He said, "3 things." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "First, the logbook. Strict reading of the regulations says government property. Established practice across the last 40 years says where a decommissioned station record has come into private hands, by an arrangement clearly intended by the last keeper, and where the private custodian is committed to preservation in situ. The historian's office may execute a permanent loan agreement. The book stays here. It stays in a humidity-controlled case. We will provide the case. The Coast Guard retains nominal title. You retain custody. Dr. Conway will draft the paperwork on the drive home this afternoon. Acceptable. Wren said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Second." The letter. The letter is a personal communication addressed to whoever finds the shelf. That is you. The letter is yours. We will photograph it for the archive. The original stays with you. If you ever choose to donate it, we would be grateful. We will not ask again. She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Third." The gold. He paused. He said, "Chief Caldwell died in Elizabeth City in 1971. No wife, no children. One sister who died in 1989 with no surviving issue. I have already had our Office of Legal Counsel run the question. Under North Carolina General Statute 116B, after 65 years of unclaimed status, personal property of this kind reverts to the lawful holder of the real property on which it is found. That is you. Counsel is willing to put this in writing. There will be a process. It will take 3 months. At the end of those 3 months, you will be the legal owner of 28 Liberty Double Eagles minted between 1907 and 1925. The spot value as of yesterday's London fix is approximately $58,000. The numismatic value sold properly to a dealer in coins of this period is closer to 72. He looked at her. He said, "Miss Calloway, I want to be careful here." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "That is enough money sold well to put a new roof on this station, replace the porch and the boat ramp, install a proper septic drill, a working well, and leave you a small reserve for the next storm. Or it is enough money sold all at once to walk out of here, buy a small house in Hatteras Village, and never mend another net for $14 an hour." He said, "I am not in this room to advise you on that decision. I am in this room to tell you that the decision is legally yours to make." He folded his hands. Wren looked at the pouch on the table. She looked at the letter on the logbook. She looked at the brass clock 8-day movement ticking quietly at her left elbow. She thought of her father in October of 2018 sitting on this porch for 3 hours, and then driving to Mrs. Holcomb's counter to ask whether the price could be held at $10. She thought of Chief Caldwell on the 30th of September, 1958, sealing a letter with a brittle bead of pine tar on the small wooden shelf behind a wall. She thought of her grandmother Ruth at the kitchen table in 2010, with a sharpened pencil and a green ledger, and a 10-year-old girl beside her. A fishing family does not survive by catching the most fish. A fishing family survives by knowing exactly what the fish it catches are worth. She said, "Commander." He said, "Yes, Miss Calloway." She said, "I'm going to sell 4 coins." He waited. She said 4 coins sold well ought to come to about $10,000. That is enough to put new tin on the porch, replace the southeast plywood, and the broken glass restock the cedar shingles, and set aside the rest in a separate account at the Manteo Bank as a maintenance fund. The remaining 24 coins go in a safe deposit box at the same bank. When the maintenance fund runs low, I sell one more. When that runs out, I sell another. The gold leaves this station only when the station needs it. When the last coin goes 20 years from now, 30, 50, whenever that is, there will be another Callaway, or there will be somebody else who has stood a watch, and they will figure out what comes next. She paused. She said Chief Caldwell saved that money 17 years for himself. He left it for the station. I am going to leave it for the station too. I am not going to spend his savings on a house in Hatteras Village. Doyle was quiet for a moment. Then he said Chief Caldwell would have approved of that arrangement, Miss Callaway. She said, I hope so, sir. He stood up. He extended his hand across the table. She stood up. She took it. They shook once. He said, Welcome to the keeper's rolls, such as they are. Dr. Conway, packing her gloves back into her case, said quietly without looking up, There are not many of you left. Earl ran them back across the Sound at 3. Wren stood on the porch and watched the whaler grow small. Hadley came across the Sound on the second Saturday of October. She came alone in a rented 16-foot aluminum skiff Earl had reserved for her at the marina. She wore jeans and a barn coat and rubber boots, and her hair was in a single dark braid down her back. She had not braided her hair in 11 years. She tied off at the cedar stake. She walked up the path with her hands in the pockets of the barn coat. Wren met her on the porch. Hadley did not say hello. She walked past Wren into the front room, and she stopped at the oak table, and she stood there for a long moment, looking at the logbook in its new humidity-controlled case, at the center of the table, and the framed letter beside it, and the brass clock on the shelf, and the green ledger, and Whitman's tool chest. And she did not move for some span of seconds that might have been 20 and might have been 3 minutes. Then she turned around. She said, Wren. Wren said Hadley. Hadley sat down on the bench on the far side of the table. She put her hands flat on the wood. She said, I need to tell you something. I have been not telling you something since November. I think it is time. Wren sat down on the other side of the table. She said, All right. Hadley said Crawford lost his job in February of 2024. Wren waited. Hadley said, Carolina First Trust, senior investment analyst. The bank was caught in the regional banking crisis last spring. The FDIC took the parent over. 340 people lost their jobs in one Friday afternoon. Crawford was one of them. He did not tell me right away. He thought he would find something quickly. He looked for 6 months. Nothing. He had been making $170,000 a year. There is nothing else in Raleigh paying that for a 30-year-old analyst with no MBA. We had been living on what we made. We had savings, but the savings were for a down payment on a house in Wake Forest. The savings were not for 9 months of unemployment for a man who had been wearing a suit and had to keep wearing the suit so I would not know. Wren said very quietly, Hadley. Hadley said in August he met a man at a recovery group. The man said he was an investment manager. The man said he had a fund in Charlotte that was returning 11% quarterly. The man gave Crawford a slick PDF. Crawford put $96,000 of our savings into the fund. The fund was a Ponzi. The man was arrested in October. The principal is gone. Every dollar. She paused. Hadley said 3 weeks later Dad died. Wren said Hadley. Hadley said that was why I needed the $120,000. That was why I could not say leave the boat. That was why I sat across from you at the kitchen table in November and read you the balance sheet like a Carolina Trust analyst and not like a sister. I owed credit cards and I owed our parents' Charlotte friend who had carried us in October. And I owed the IRS for a quarter we missed and I needed every dollar of my share. I knew if I told you, you would have offered to give me yours. I was not going to let a Callaway pay for Crawford's mistake. Mama wrote that letter for a reason. The water money was yours. I was not going to let you put it in Raleigh. Wren did not say anything for a long time. The brass clock ticked. The Atlantic moved against the boat ramp at the foot of the dune. Then Wren said, "Where is he now?" Hadley said, "Charlotte, with his parents. He is in treatment. Not for the gambling exactly. He never gambled. He was a man who lost his job and then made one bad decision and then could not undo it. He is in treatment for the depression that came afterward. We are separated. I do not hate him. I think he is a good man who broke for one season. I do not yet know if I can stay married to a man who broke for one season. I have not made that decision." Wren said, "And you?" Hadley said, "I am living with a friend in Wake Forest. I started part-time at Wake Forest School of Law in August, night sessions. I am 24. I will be 27 when I finish. I want to come back to Manteo. I want to do legal aid work in this county. I want to help people who do not know what a special provision 4 is until a clerk tells them." She paused. She said, "I am sorry, Wren. About all of it. About November. About the way I read the balance sheet. About Mama's letter sitting in a drawer for 5 months before I could give it to you. About not coming to the funeral with a sister, and instead coming with a folder." Wren said Hadley. Hadley said yes. Wren said, "The upstairs has a small room. There is a bed. There is a window that looks at the sound. When you need it, the room is yours. You do not have to ask." Hadley looked at her sister across the table. She did not cry. Callaway's did the sequence first and the crying later. She said, "Thank you." She said, "I will use it." They drank coffee on the porch. The sun went down across Pamlico Sound at 6:41. Hadley stayed the night in the upstairs room. She slept 8 hours, the deepest sleep she had slept since the August telephone call from the FDIC trustee. In the morning, she ran the rented skiff back to Hatteras at first light. Wren stood on the porch and watched her go. Hadley raised one hand at the helm. Wren raised one hand back. She did not wave. Waving was for people you had just met. Word of the station got out the way word in a place like the Outer Banks always gets out. Not through any newspaper. Through a fish house counter, through a marina office, through a VFW post-breakfast. On a Saturday, through the soft underground telephone of men in their 70s and 80s, who had served in the same uniform 60 years before in different waters under different flags. By Thanksgiving of 2025, 4 Coast Guard auxiliary blazers in Manteo knew. By Christmas, the auxiliary chapter in Elizabeth City knew. By February of 2026, a man in Cape May, New Jersey, who edited a quarterly newsletter for retired surfmen of the 5th District, ran a small unillustrated paragraph at the bottom of page 4. The first visitor came on a Saturday in March. His name was Russell Tate. He was 92 years old. He had served as a surfman at Station 14 from June of 1955 through the morning of the 1st of October 1958, when he and Chief Caldwell and Surfman Brennan and Surfman Stokes had closed the door and walked down the boat ramp to the motor launch waiting in the surf. His grandson, a 58-year-old commercial real estate broker from Greenville, North Carolina, brought him over from Manteo in a borrowed 20-foot skiff. The grandson carried a folded wheelchair up the path. Russell Tate walked the path himself slowly, with a 4-pronged cane in his right hand and the grandson's left arm in his left. He stopped on the porch. He took off his ball cap. He set it against his chest. He said, "I have not stood on these boards in 68 years." Wren said, "Welcome back, sir." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Who are you, child?" She said, "My name is Wren Calloway. My great-grandfather was Whitman Calloway. Chief Caldwell pulled him off the Ruth Ann in '44. Russell Tate's eyes did a thing that Wren had not seen eyes do before. They went very far away, the way the eyes of an old man go very far away when he is hearing a sentence he has not heard from another human being in 70 years. And then they came back and they were wet. He said, "I was 13 years old when that rescue happened. I was on Ocracoke. I read about it in the Dare County newspaper. I joined the Coast Guard in '54 because of that rescue. Chief Caldwell was already a legend by the time I got here. He had a year to go before the station closed. I had 11 months under him. The best 11 months of my life." He turned to his grandson. He said, "Help me up." The grandson did not understand at first. Russell Tate said, "The stairs. Help me up the stairs. I want to see the signal room." The grandson said, "Granddad Russell." Russell Tate said, "I have come a long way. Help me up the stairs." It took them 11 minutes. Wren brought a kitchen chair to the top of the staircase. They sat Russell on it. Then they helped him to the foot of the ladder to the signal room. Russell looked up the ladder. He looked at the carving on the doorframe. He put his hand on the carving. He held it there. He said, "I watched him cut these. June of '58. He used his folding knife. He said it would outlast the building. Looks like he was right. He could not climb the ladder. He sat on the chair beneath the carving for 12 minutes, and he did not speak. When they came back down, Wren brought him to the oak table. She showed him the logbook in its case. She turned with the cotton gloves Dr. Conway had left to September of 1944. She showed him Caldwell's hand on the page. Russell Tate read the entry twice. Then he reached inside his coat. He took out a small flat object wrapped in a square of clean white cotton. He laid it on the table. He unfolded the cotton. It was a brass duty whistle on a worn black cord. The brass was scratched. The cord was supple from 68 years of being against a man's collarbone. He said, "Chief gave me this whistle on the morning of the 1st of October, 1958. We were standing in the boat that took us off the island. He took it off his own neck. He said, 'Tate, you keep this for as long as you can keep it. When you can't keep it any longer, find the station and put it back.' I have been keeping it for 68 years. I cannot keep it much longer. I am putting it back." He pushed the whistle across the table to Wren. He said, "It belongs here, with his letter, with his book." Wren said, "Sir." He said, "Take it, child. That's the watch passing." She took it. She hung the whistle on a small brass hook that Earl had set into the beadboard wall above the oak table the previous month, for no particular reason at the time, in a spot that now looked to anyone who walked into the room like a spot that had been waiting for a whistle since 1917. Russell Tate left at 4. He died 11 weeks later in his sleep in his own bed in Greenville. His grandson called Wren from the funeral home. The grandson said, "He told us 2 days before he passed that he had completed the last assignment Chief gave him. He said he was square." Wren said, "Yes, sir." He was square. The grandson said he wanted me to tell you something. He said, "Tell the girl that she has the watch now." He said she will know what that means. Wren said, "I do, sir. Thank you for calling." She hung up. She stood in the front room of the station for a long time. Then she went to the wall and she took the whistle off the hook and she walked out onto the porch. And she stood facing the Atlantic and she put the whistle to her lips. And she blew one long, flat note that traveled out across the dune and across the surf and out toward the gray September horizon. And the note was not loud, and it was not musical, and it was, in some way, she could not name the sound of a promise being received and signed for. She hung the whistle back on the hook. She made coffee. She went back to work. A second visitor came in May. His name was Walter Perry. He was 78 years old, a Korean War veteran, and he was the grandson of Eugene Perry, aged 32, mate of the Ruth Ann rescued the morning of the 14th of September, 1944. He had driven down from Norfolk. He stood in the signal room for a long time without speaking. Before he left, he gave Wren a black and white photograph from 1945, taken on this porch. Eugene Perry, smiling his hand on the shoulder of a much younger Chief Caldwell. Wren framed the photograph in cedar she pulled from a salvage pile in Avon and she hung it on the wall beside Caldwell's letter. And the two faces now sat at the same height, one above the oak table, and one beside it, with the brass whistle hanging between them, like a sentence inside its own punctuation. The visitors became a small, steady current after that. School children from Cape Hatteras Elementary in life jackets brought across the sound on a chartered pontoon, 22 of them in a row on the porch, with their fifth-grade teacher, Miss Lawson, who had been in Wren's own graduating class at the high school. Wren walked them through the front room and read aloud from photocopies she had typed herself the entry of the 14th of September, 1944. A small boy in the third row, brown-haired, freckled, raised his hand and said, "Was your great-grandfather scared?" Wren said, "I imagine he was, son. I imagine they all were. Being scared and going out anyway is what the watch is." Coast Guard auxiliary delegations from Manteo and Elizabeth City and Hatteras Village, 4 blazers at a time, who stood with their ball caps in their hands at the oak table the way men of their generation stood at the open coffin of a friend, a retired chief warrant officer from Cape May, who had served 2 tours of Greenland patrol in the 1980s and who, hearing Earl Whitaker's name, asked if Earl was the same Whitaker who had been on Storis in '78, and who, when Earl came over to the station the following Sunday, the 2 men shook hands on the porch and did not speak for a full minute, and then sat down on the porch steps and traded the names of dead friends for an hour. A retired Coast Guard chaplain from Beaufort, who blessed the oak table with a small bowl of water from the cistern, the way that order of chaplain had been blessing tables on barrier islands for 120 years. The Charlotte Observer ran a small Sunday feature in August. The piece was respectful. It did not give the address of the island. It did not name the gold. It quoted Wren one time, the quote being, "I did not buy a property. I bought a promise." Travis Berman read the piece in Wilmington on a Sunday morning over coffee. He folded the paper. He laid it on the kitchen counter. He did not say anything to his wife. The next month, he closed on a property in Currituck County that he had been negotiating since spring. He never spoke of Station 14 again in public or in private to any person living. Edith Sayre stood for re-election the following November. She lost to a woman named Annabelle Tarkington, who had been the librarian at the Manteo Public Library for 19 years, and who had run on a single-issue platform of historical preservation of coastal North Carolina. Mrs. Tarkington had quoted Wren's hearing room speech 12 times during the campaign. Sayre received 41% of the vote and conceded at 10 p.m. on election night, and her concession speech mentioned the station once briefly, in a sentence that had been written for her by her chief of staff, and that she did not believe. September 2027. 3 years to the day near enough. Wren Calloway was 25 years old. The afternoon had been long and bright. The light off the Atlantic, that particular shade of late summer pale gold, that the old keepers had called keeper blue, because at the very end of the day, in the last 40 seconds before the sun cleared the horizon, the air above the water went briefly to the deep, clean color of a Coast Guard service jacket. Her father had called it keeper blue, too. So had Walter. So had Whitman. The maintenance fund at the Manteo Bank stood at $14,300. She had sold 5 Liberty Double Eagles across 2 years. The first 4 had gone to porch, tin, and shingles, and a new septic, and the lower corner plywood, and a hand-pumped well that now drew clean water from 61 feet down. The 5th had funded a humidity-controlled case for Caldwell's letter, and a second case for the photograph of Eugene Perry and Chief Caldwell on the porch in 1945. 23 coins remained in the safe deposit box at the Manteo branch. The brass ship's clock on the kitchen shelf was that Sunday into the 3rd turn of its 8-day week. Hadley had passed the North Carolina bar in July. She had moved into a small rented bungalow in Manteo on the 1st of August, 4 blocks from Mrs. Holcomb's office, and had started as a staff attorney at the Outer Banks Legal Aid Society on the 11th. Her caseload in the first 6 weeks was 43 open files, most of them tenant eviction defenses for fishing families behind on rent after a slow summer. Crawford Marsh was clean of the depression. He was working as a junior analyst at a credit union in Charlotte for $48,000 a year, less than a third of what he had made at Carolina First. He and Hadley had begun to speak again weekly on the phone on Wednesday evenings. They had not yet decided what came next. Both of them were learning that some decisions cannot be made until they have been waited on for a longer time than either party initially wanted to wait. Earl Whitaker, 73, came over to the station every Sunday morning at 9 with 2 pieces of buttered toast wrapped in a paper napkin and walked the building with Wren for an hour looking for things that needed doing. The fish house room above the freezer was somebody else's room now. A young man from Buxton named Cole Stowe, the grandson of Marlene the harbor master, 20 years old, who had just signed on as second mate on a long line out of Wanchese. Wren sat that Sunday evening on the porch steps, facing the Atlantic in her father's Carhartt jacket and her grandmother's wool watch cap pulled down to her eyebrows, with a tin mug of coffee in her hands. Behind her on the long oak table inside the front room, the logbook in its case open to the 14th of September, 1944. The letter framed beside it behind glass, the tar bead, now permanently fixed to the lower left corner of the cream paper. The photograph of Eugene Perry and Chief Caldwell on the porch in 1945. The brass duty whistle of surfman Russell Tate hanging from its hook. The brass ship's clock from the bulkhead of the Eleanor R. Ruth's green ledger. Whitman's wooden tool chest from Bath, Maine, 1921. 6 generations of objects in one room on one table, in one small wooden building on a barrier island where no one had stood a federal watch since the morning of the 1st of October, 1958, until a girl who had $10 in her pocket on a Tuesday in June had walked into a clerk's office in Manteo and put down a flat, unwrinkled Hamilton and 5 wrinkled singles, and had said very quietly, "I'd like to buy the life-saving station." The sun lowered itself toward Pamlico Sound at her back. The Atlantic in front of her went from pale gold to slate to the deep flat blue that her father had taught her to watch for. Keeper blue. A small commercial trawler ran south along the horizon, maybe 4 miles offshore, its running lights just beginning to show against the dusk. She watched it. She did not know the boat. she did not need to. There was a stern man on that boat somewhere, with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking back at the dark line of the Outer Banks falling away astern, and feeling the peculiar, pure happiness of being a person who is already at work, while the rest of the country is asleep. She thought of Whitman walking off the dock at Bath in 1921, with the tool chest under one arm, and the chart of the Atlantic seaboard rolled inside the other. Well, all right then. She thought of Walter screwing the brass clock to the bulkhead of the Eleanor R. in the summer of 1978, with the 8-day key in his shirt pocket, and a son and a wife and a slip in Hatteras Harbor that he believed he would keep until he died, which in the end he did. She thought of Caldwell in the lantern light of the signal room on the 30th of September, 1958, setting the tar seal on a cream-colored letter to a person he would never meet on a wooden shelf behind an iron locker that would not be opened for 67 years. She thought of her father sitting on this porch in October of 2018 for 3 hours, and then driving up Highway 12 and asking Mrs. Holcomb whether the price could be held at $10 and waiting 6 more years for a daughter to find her own way to the door. She thought of Hadley, 27 now, putting on a charcoal blazer in a rented bungalow in Manteo on weekday mornings, and walking 4 blocks to an office where she defended fishing families who could not afford an hour of a Raleigh attorney. She thought of Mama Eleanor, dead 19 years in a small cemetery behind the Methodist Church in Buxton, whose handwriting on a piece of cream stationery in 2006 had said, "Let Hadley have the books. Let Wren have the boat," and who had not lived to see the boat sold or the books bought, but who had in some way. Wren did not have a name for been right about every one of her children. There is a thing about the watches our fathers and grandfathers kept. We do not always know when we are 4 years old, standing on the deck of a trawler, learning to coil a dock line, that the line is not the point. The point is the standing. The point is being on the water at 4:30 in the morning when no one else is on the water. The point is being awake when the rest of the world is asleep. The point is reading a sky that has not yet decided what it is gonna do. A watch is not a job. A watch is an agreement between a person and a stretch of water that the person will keep paying attention even when there is nothing to see. The old keepers understood this. They stood in towers on barrier islands for decades, looking at an ocean that was most nights empty and dark and indifferent. And they did not stop looking because the one night they stopped looking would be the one night a ship went down within sight of the tower, and there would be no one awake to see it. Our fathers teach us this without using the word watch. They teach us by waking us up at 4:30. They teach us by letting us take the helm on calm afternoons and watching us from the stern without saying anything. They teach us by hanging a brass clock on a bulkhead and winding it every Sunday morning for 23 years. And then, years after they are gone, we climb a ladder into a small square room at the top of a tower on a barrier island, and we reach behind an iron locker, and we find a letter from a man who kept the same kind of watch our father kept. And we understand finally that our father was not teaching us to fish. Our father was teaching us to stay awake. The trawler on the horizon was a pinprick of green starboard light now almost gone. Wren stood up from the porch step. She finished her coffee. She went inside. She set the tin mug on the kitchen sideboard. She went to the brass clock on the shelf. She picked up the 8-day key. She wound the clock 8 full turns the way her grandfather had taught her father, the way her father had taught her, the way Whitman had wound a clock of his own on a deck running south out of Bath in 1921. It was Sunday. A Callaway wound the clock on Sunday. That was the rule. She set the key beside the clock. She closed the front door of the station for the night and slid the iron crossbar into its bracket. Outside, the Atlantic went on the way. The Atlantic had been going on for 114 years. Against this dune, against this porch, against this small wooden building with its silver shingles and its decapitated signal tower and its iron-bolted flag locker on the second floor. Wren Callaway was 25 years old. She had $10 in her checking account on the day she bought the station. She had spent them on a 114-year-old life-saving station on a barrier island 9 miles north of Hatteras. They were the best $10 she ever spent. And somewhere far up the long, dim slope of the second floor, on the doorframe of a small storage closet, 6 feet from the foot of a ladder to a signal room with an empty brass lamp, Mount 4 small block letters carved in 1958 went on, holding the warmth of the building below them. The way a thing held in trust holds the warmth of the hands that pass it forward, for as long as there are hands willing to receive it. All right, then.